What happens when the son of a plantation's executioner inherits more than just his father's name? In 1859, beneath the shadow of a punishment shed, a legend was born that would be whispered in fear for generations. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible historical stories that will leave you speechless. The year was 1859, and the Blackwood Plantation in rural Georgia stretched across thousands of acres like a kingdom built on suffering. The cotton fields swayed in the humid breeze, their white bowls ready for harvest. But beneath their deceptive beauty lay a darkness that had festered for decades. The red clay soil had been watered with blood, sweat, and tears for generations, creating a foundation of misery that seemed as permanent as the ancient oak trees that dotted the landscape. In the quarters where the enslaved lived, cramped wooden cabins arranged in neat rows like a military camp, there was one dwelling that stood slightly apart from the others. Not by choice, but by necessity. It belonged to Denzel, known throughout the plantation as the Hangman's son. The isolation wasn't just physical, it was social, emotional, and spiritual. Even among the oppressed, there were degrees of separation, and Denzel occupied a unique and terrible position in the plantation's hierarchy of suffering. Denzel's father, Moses, had been the plantation's executioner, a role forced upon him by Master Blackwood 20 years prior when the previous executioner died of fever. When an enslaved person was sentenced to death for attempting escape, rebellion, or any other act deemed unforgivable by their masters, it was Moses who carried out the sentence. The other enslaved people feared and resented him. Though they understood intellectually that he had no choice, the psychological burden of being forced to kill his own people had slowly destroyed Moses from within, turning him into a hollow shell of a man who spoke little and smiled never. The masters trusted him precisely because they believed his position made him loyal, but they were wrong. It had made him dead inside. Moses had tried to shield his son from the worst of it, but on a plantation there were no secrets that lasted long. Denzel grew up knowing that his father's hands had taken lives, that the other children whispered about him behind his back, that even the adults looked at him with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Would the son follow in his father's footsteps? Was the capacity for violence hereditary? These questions haunted Denzel's childhood and shaped his character in ways both obvious and subtle. When Moses died 3 years ago, found one morning hanging from a rope in his cabin, whether by his own hand or another's was never determined, Denzel inherited more than just his father's meager possessions. He inherited the hatred, the fear, the suspicion, and most importantly, the heavy iron chains that had been used for executions. Master Blackwood kept them as a reminder and a threat, hanging them in the punishment shed where Denzel now worked as the overseer's assistant. Every day he was forced to look at the instruments that had destroyed his father's soul and claimed so many lives. Denzel was 28 years old, tall and powerfully built from years of hard labor that had started when he was barely old enough to walk. His hands were scarred from working with metal in the plantation's forge, where he had learned to repair tools and fashion implements of bondage. His eyes held a depth that spoke of someone who had seen too much suffering, absorbed too much pain, and carried too many secrets. Unlike his father, Denzel had never been forced to take a life, but he had witnessed countless punishments, beatings, and the slow death of hope in his people's eyes. He had held dying men in his arms, comforted women after they were violated, and watched children grow old before their time under the weight of oppression. The 6 masters, who controlled different aspects of the plantation, had grown comfortable with Denzel's presence over the years. Master Blackwood, the owner, was a cruel man in his 60s who took genuine pleasure in others' pain. His pale blue eyes held no warmth, and his thin lips seemed permanently curved in a sneer of disdain. His son, Thomas Blackwood, was even worse, young, violent, and unpredictable, with a hair-trigger temper that could explode over the smallest perceived slight. The overseer, Jake Morrison, was a poor white man from the mountains who used his position to feel superior to someone, anyone, after a lifetime of being looked down upon by his social betters. Dr. Henry Walsh served as the plantation doctor, but was more interested in experimenting on the enslaved than healing them, viewing them as perfect subjects for his twisted medical curiosity. Benjamin Carter managed the finances and saw the enslaved as nothing more than numbers on a ledger, calculating their worth down to the penny based on age, health, and productivity. Finally, there was Reverend Marcus Stone, who preached that slavery was God's will while living comfortably off the plantation's profits, his sermons a masterpiece of theological gymnastics that justified the unjustifiable. These 6 men had grown so accustomed to Denzel's quiet presence during their meetings in the punishment shed that they spoke freely in front of him, as if he were invisible, or, worse, as if he were an inanimate object incapable of understanding or remembering their words. They discussed their cruelest plans, their methods of control, and their complete disregard for human life with casual indifference, the way other men might discuss the weather or the price of cotton. To them, Denzel was part of the furniture, useful when needed, ignored when not, and never considered as a thinking, feeling human being with his own thoughts, desires, and capacity for action. But Denzel was listening. He was always listening, his mind sharp and his memory perfect. Every cruel word, every casual threat, every callous decision was recorded in his consciousness like entries in a ledger of injustice. He had learned to school his features into a mask of servile compliance while his mind worked constantly, analyzing, planning, and preparing for a day that he had always known would come. On this particular evening in late September, the air was thick with the promise of rain and the oppressive humidity that made the Georgia climate so unbearable. The cotton harvest was nearly complete, and tensions were high as the masters pushed for maximum productivity before the weather turned. Denzel had been ordered to clean the punishment shed after a particularly brutal day that had seen 3 people whipped for allegedly stealing food. Food that Denzel knew had been deliberately withheld to justify the punishment and serve as an example to others. As he worked, scrubbing blood from the wooden floor with a coarse brush and lye soap that burned his hands, Denzel's eyes repeatedly fell upon his father's chains, hanging on the wall like a grotesque decoration. They were heavy, forged from iron that had been heated and shaped by enslaved hands in the plantation's forge decades ago. Each link represented a life lost, a family destroyed, a dream crushed under the weight of absolute power, corrupted absolutely. The metal had been polished smooth by years of use and handling, and in the lamplight it seemed to gleam with a malevolent life of its own. "You thinking about your daddy again, boy?" Denzel turned to see Jake Morrison standing in the doorway, a bottle of whiskey in his hand, and cruelty dancing in his bloodshot eyes. Morrison was drunk, as he often was in the evenings, and alcohol always made him more vicious and unpredictable. His clothes were stained with sweat and dirt, and his unwashed body gave off an odor that mixed unpleasantly with the smell of cheap liquor. "Just cleaning, sir," Denzel replied quietly, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him like pressure in a steam boiler. He had learned long ago to keep his emotions hidden, to present a facade of compliance while his true feelings burned like coals in his chest. "Your daddy was useful," Morrison continued, stepping into the shed and swaying slightly on his feet. "Kept the others in line real good, made them remember their place, but you're different. I see it in your eyes sometimes. You think you're better than your place, don't you, boy?" Denzel said nothing, continuing his work with methodical precision. But Morrison wasn't finished with his torment. The overseer seemed to feed on the discomfort of others, drawing strength from their pain like a parasite. Maybe it's time we reminded you what happens to uppity slaves. Maybe it's time those chains got some use again. Your daddy's been dead 3 years now, and folks are starting to forget what happens when they step out of line. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Denzel's hands stilled on the mop, his knuckles white with tension as he gripped the handle. For years, he had endured their words, their casual cruelty, their complete dehumanization of his people. He had swallowed his pride, bitten his tongue, and buried his rage so deep that sometimes he wondered if it had died altogether. But something was different tonight. Something fundamental had shifted in the depths of his soul, like tectonic plates moving beneath the earth's surface. As Morrison, laughing at his own perceived cleverness and stumbling slightly as he made his way back to the main house, Denzel stood alone in the shed with his father's chains. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder and the soft patter of rain beginning to fall on the roof. He reached up and touched the chains, feeling their weight, their cold metal surface that had been warmed by so much blood and tears over the years. "Forgive me, Papa," he whispered to the empty air, his voice barely audible above the growing storm. "But I can't be you. I won't be their tool anymore. I won't let them break me the way they broke you." Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance like the voice of an angry god, and Denzel began to plan. The time for submission was over. The time for justice had finally come. 3 days later, the 6 masters gathered in the punishment shed for their weekly meeting, a ritual that had become as regular as Sunday service, but infinitely more sinister. It was their custom to discuss plantation business away from the main house, where they could speak freely about their methods of control and future plans without fear of being overheard by their wives or visiting neighbors who might have more delicate sensibilities. The shed had become their private sanctuary of cruelty, a place where they could drop their masks of civilization and reveal the monsters that lurked beneath. Denzel had been ordered to serve them whiskey and maintain the oil lamps while they talked, a role that required him to be present but invisible, useful but insignificant. To them, he was part of the furniture, a breathing, moving object that could pour drinks and trim wicks, but possessed no thoughts, feelings, or capacity for independent action. They had grown so comfortable with his presence that they spoke as freely as if they were alone, never considering that their words might be heard, understood, and remembered by someone who had every reason to hate them. The shed had been transformed for their meeting, with a rough wooden table placed in the center and chairs arranged around it. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere that was both intimate and ominous. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of expensive whiskey, luxuries that stood in stark contrast to the suffering that had taken place in this very room. Master Blackwood sat at the head of the table, his weathered face illuminated by flickering lamplight that emphasized every cruel line and harsh angle. His pale eyes swept over his companions with the satisfaction of a man who held absolute power over hundreds of human lives. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the authority of decades of unchallenged dominance, "we have a problem that requires our immediate attention. The slaves are getting restless. There's been talk of escape attempts, and I've heard whispers of rebellion from some of the field hands." Dr. Walsh leaned forward, his thin fingers steepled in front of his gaunt face. The doctor was a man who found intellectual pleasure in others' suffering, viewing pain as a fascinating subject for study rather than something to be alleviated. "Perhaps we need to make an example," he suggested with clinical detachment. "A public execution might remind them of their place in the natural order. I've been studying the psychological effects of fear, and I believe a properly orchestrated display of punishment could be quite effective in maintaining discipline." "Who would you suggest?" asked Benjamin Carter, looking up from his ever-present ledger where he tracked every aspect of the plantation's operations with mathematical precision. "We can't afford to lose too many workers with harvest season approaching. Each able-bodied slave represents a significant investment, and we must balance the need for discipline with economic practicality." Thomas Blackwood, the master's son, slammed his fist on the table with the impulsive violence that characterized his every action. At 25, he possessed all of his father's cruelty, but none of his restraint or strategic thinking. "I say we take the troublemakers and make them suffer in ways they'll never forget," he snarled, his face flushed with alcohol and excitement. "Break a few bones, brand some faces, maybe cut off a finger or two. Fear is the only language these animals understand, and we need to speak it fluently." Reverend Stone nodded solemnly, his round face assuming an expression of pious concern that would have been laughable if it weren't so genuinely evil. "The Bible teaches us that the rod of correction drives foolishness from the heart." He intoned in the same voice he used for Sunday sermons. "We must be firm in our discipline, for it is not only our right, but our Christian duty to guide these lost souls through proper correction. Spare the rod and spoil the child, as Scripture tells us." Denzel stood in the shadows, refilling glasses and tending the lamps with mechanical precision, but his mind was recording every word with perfect clarity. These men spoke of human beings as if they were discussing livestock, planning torture as casually as they might plan a dinner menu. Each word was another weight added to the scales of justice that had been building in his heart for years. Morrison took a long drink and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, leaving a wet stain on his already filthy sleeve. "I've got my eye on a few of them," he said, with the satisfaction of a hunter discussing his prey. "That woman Sarah who works in the kitchen, she's been giving me looks that I don't like. Too much pride in those eyes, if you ask me. And her boy Marcus, he's getting too big for his britches. Maybe it's time to separate them. Sell the boy downriver to one of those sugar plantations in Louisiana. Nothing breaks a woman's spirit like losing her child." "Excellent idea," Master Blackwood agreed, his thin lips curving in what might have been called a smile if it had contained any warmth or humanity. "Breaking up families always serves as an effective deterrent. The emotional bonds these people form are their greatest weakness, and we must exploit that weakness ruthlessly. What about you, Denzel?" The question caught Denzel off guard like a physical blow. All 6 men turned to look at him, and for a moment the shed fell silent except for the sound of rain beginning to fall harder on the roof and the soft hiss of the oil lamps. Their eyes were predatory, expectant, waiting for him to reveal something that they could use against him or his people. "Sir?" Denzel asked carefully, his voice betraying nothing of the turmoil raging inside him. "Your father always had good insights into the slave mentality," Master Blackwood continued, his voice taking on a tone of false friendliness that was somehow more threatening than open hostility. "Moses understood how these people think, what motivates them, what breaks them. Who do you think we should make an example of? Which of your fellow slaves needs to be reminded of their place?" Denzel's throat felt dry as desert sand. They wanted him to betray his own people, to become complicit in their suffering, just as his father had been forced to do. The weight of their expectation pressed down on him like a physical force, threatening to crush him under its enormity. This was the moment he had always dreaded, the choice that had destroyed his father's soul and driven him to his death. I don't know, sir," Denzel managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just do my work and try to stay out of trouble." Thomas Blackwood laughed harshly, the sound echoing off the wooden walls like the bark of a rabid dog. "Look at him, father. He's just like the rest of them, stupid and useless when it comes to thinking, all brawn and no brains, just the way we like them." "Perhaps," the elder Blackwood mused, his pale eyes studying Denzel with the intensity of a scientist examining a specimen. But his father's blood runs in his veins. Moses understood the necessity of discipline, even if it took some convincing. Maybe Denzel just needs the right motivation to unlock his potential. Dr. Walsh smiled coldly, his thin face taking on an expression of anticipation that made Denzel's skin crawl. "I could help with that," the doctor offered with obvious relish. "A few sessions in my medical quarters, and he might become more cooperative. I've been developing some interesting techniques for attitude adjustment that I'd love to test on a subject with his particular background." The casual way they discussed torturing him sent ice through Denzel's veins. But it also crystallized something that had been building inside him for years, like pressure in a boiler. These men saw him as less than human, and they always would. No amount of compliance, no degree of submission would ever earn him their respect or mercy. He was nothing more than a tool to them, and when a tool stopped being useful, it was discarded or destroyed. As the meeting continued, they discussed their plans in horrifying detail. They would begin with public whippings to establish their authority, then move to family separations to break the spirits of the strongest, and finally to executions, if necessary, to eliminate any remaining resistance. They spoke of using Denzel's father's chains for the hangings, making him assist just as Moses had been forced to do, continuing the cycle of horror that had defined his family's existence. "It's poetic justice," Morrison said with a drunken grin that revealed his yellowed teeth. "The hangman's son carrying on the family tradition, like father, like son, as they say." Denzel's hands trembled as he poured whiskey, but not from fear. The rage that had been simmering inside him for years was finally reaching its boiling point, threatening to explode with volcanic force. These men had destroyed countless lives, torn apart families, and committed atrocities that would haunt the survivors forever. And they did it all with smiles on their faces and scripture on their lips, convinced of their own righteousness and superiority. As the rain grew heavier outside, drumming against the shed's roof like an angry heartbeat, Denzel made his decision. His father had been forced to be their instrument of death, broken and molded into a tool of oppression that ultimately destroyed him. But Denzel would choose a different path. He would choose to be their judgment, their reckoning, their final lesson in the consequences of absolute power corrupted absolutely. The meeting was winding down, the men growing more intoxicated and careless with their words. They spoke of their wives, their comfortable lives, their plans for expanding the plantation's operations into new territories. They lived in luxury, built on the backs of human suffering, and they felt no shame about it. If anything, they took pride in their efficiency, their ability to extract maximum profit from human misery. "Same time next week, gentlemen," Master Blackwood announced as they began to rise from their chairs, their movements unsteady from alcohol and the comfortable satisfaction of men who believed themselves untouchable. "And remember, we must present a united front. The slaves must see that we are in complete control, that resistance is not only futile, but unthinkable." As they prepared to leave, Denzel moved to extinguish the lamps as he had done countless times before. But instead of snuffing them out, he turned them up, filling the shed with bright flickering light that cast dancing shadows on the walls and illuminated every corner of the room. The men paused, confused by his actions and suddenly aware that something was different about their usually invisible servant. "What are you doing, boy?" Morrison demanded, his voice sharp with suspicion and the first hint of unease. Denzel straightened slowly, his full height imposing in the lamplight, his powerful frame casting a long shadow across the room. For the first time in his life, he looked directly into their eyes, without lowering his gaze, without showing the deference they had come to expect and demand. "I want you to see clearly," he said quietly, his voice steady and calm despite the storm raging inside him. "I want you to see what's coming. The six masters exchanged glances, suddenly aware that something fundamental had changed. The submissive slave they thought they knew was gone, replaced by someone they didn't recognize. Someone who no longer feared them, no longer accepted their authority, no longer acknowledged their right to rule over him. And hanging on the wall behind Denzel, his father's chains seemed to gleam with anticipation in the dancing light, waiting for their moment of redemption. The atmosphere in the shed shifted like the air before a tornado, heavy with electricity and the promise of destruction. The six masters, who moments before had been laughing and planning atrocities with the casual indifference of men discussing the weather, now found themselves facing something they had never encountered in their privileged lives, a slave who was no longer afraid, no longer willing to submit, no longer accepting of their assumed superiority. Denzel reached up and lifted his father's chains from their hooks on the wall, the metal cold and heavy in his hands, like the weight of history itself. Each link was a testament to the lives that had been lost, the families destroyed, the dreams crushed under the boot of oppression. But tonight, they would serve a different purpose. Tonight, they would become instruments of justice rather than tools of terror. The chains rattled as Denzel wrapped them around his powerful forearms, the sound echoing through the shed like the tolling of a funeral bell. Years of hard labor had made him strong, stronger than any of the soft, privileged men who stood before him in various states of shock and growing alarm. They had grown comfortable in their power, never imagining that their victims might one day fight back, never considering that the very instruments of oppression they wielded so casually might one day be turned against them. "Put those down, boy," Master Blackwood commanded, his voice sharp with authority but tinged with something he rarely felt, uncertainty. "You're forgetting your place. You're forgetting who you are and who we are." "No, sir," Denzel replied, his voice steady and calm, carrying a strength that seemed to fill the entire shed. "For the first time in my life, I know exactly what my place is. I know exactly who I am. I am the son of Moses, the man you broke and destroyed. I am the voice of every person you've tortured, every family you've torn apart, every dream you've crushed. I am your judgment." The transformation was complete and terrifying. The submissive slave was gone, replaced by something primal and powerful, a force of nature that had been compressed and contained for too long and was now finally free to express itself. The masters, accustomed to absolute obedience, found themselves facing something they had no experience dealing with: genuine resistance backed by righteous fury and physical power. Morrison reached for the whip at his belt with hands that shook from alcohol and sudden fear, but Denzel was faster. The chains lashed out like a striking serpent, wrapping around Morrison's wrist and yanking him forward with irresistible force. The overseer stumbled, his face contorting with shock and pain as the metal bit into his flesh, drawing blood and crushing bone. "You can't do this!" Dr. Walsh shouted, backing toward the door with the desperate urgency of a man who suddenly realized his own mortality. "You're a slave. You have no right. This is against the natural order." "I have every right," Denzel said, his voice growing stronger with each word, carrying the weight of generations of suffering and injustice. "I have the right of every human being who has been beaten, tortured, and dehumanized. I have the right of every mother who watched her children sold away like livestock, every father who was worked to death in your fields, every soul who died believing they were less than human because you told them so." Thomas Blackwood pulled a pistol from his coat, but his hands were shaking from drink and fear, making his aim unsteady. "I'll kill you for this, you black bastard!" he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "I'll put you down like the animal you are." Denzel's eyes blazed with righteous fury, reflecting the lamplight like twin flames. "You've been killing us for years," he said with deadly calm. "You've been murdering our spirits, our hopes, our humanity. Tonight, the killing stops. Tonight, You face the consequences of your choices." The chains sang through the air with lethal precision, striking Thomas's hand and sending the pistol flying across the shed to clatter against the far wall. The young master cried out, clutching his broken fingers to his chest, blood seeping between his fingers as he stared at Denzel with a mixture of pain and disbelief. "Please," Reverend Stone whimpered, falling to his knees with his hands clasped in prayer, his round face pale with terror. "I'm a man of God. I've done nothing wrong. I've only tried to guide these people according to Scripture." Denzel turned to face the cowering preacher, his expression filled with contempt that burned like acid. "You perverted God's word to justify evil," he said, his voice carrying the weight of divine judgment. "You preached that slavery was divine will, while children died in these fields. You used Scripture as a weapon to break spirits and justify cruelty. If there is a God, Reverend, he is not on your side tonight." The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive, but it was also deeply personal. Each master faced not just physical retribution, but a reckoning with the specific cruelties they had inflicted. Denzel had watched, remembered, and catalogued every act of violence, every casual cruelty, every moment of dehumanization. Now, each man would face the consequences of his individual choices. Benjamin Carter tried to bargain, offering money and freedom in exchange for his life, his ledger forgotten as he pleaded with the desperation of a man who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "I can make you rich," he babbled, tears streaming down his face. "I know where the money is hidden. I can give you enough to buy your freedom and the freedom of others. Please be reasonable." But Denzel knew that such promises were worthless. These men had never honored their word to a slave, and they never would. Their offers of mercy came only when they were powerless, and they would be forgotten the moment they regained control. Dr. Walsh, who had experimented on slaves like laboratory animals, begged for the mercy he had never shown his victims. His clinical detachment evaporated in the face of his own mortality, replaced by the raw terror of a man who suddenly understood what it felt like to be helpless and at another's mercy. Morrison, who had separated families and sold children away from their parents, pleaded for compassion he had never possessed. The man who had taken pleasure in others' pain now writhed in agony, finally understanding the suffering he had inflicted so casually on others. One by one, they faced the consequences of their actions. The chains that had once been instruments of execution became instruments of justice, wielded not with sadistic pleasure, but with grim determination. Denzel felt no joy in their suffering, only a deep satisfaction that justice was finally being served after so many years of injustice. Master Blackwood, the patriarch of this empire of suffering, stood defiant even as his world crumbled around him. "You think this changes anything?" he gasped, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "You think killing us will free your people? There will be others to take our place. The system is bigger than us. You're just one man, and we are legion." Denzel paused, the chains heavy in his hands, considering the old man's words. "You're right," he said finally. "The system is bigger than you. But every system is made up of individuals, and every individual who perpetuates evil must be held accountable. You may be replaced, but you will not be forgotten. Your deaths will send a message that oppression has consequences." "You're making a mistake," Blackwood continued, desperation creeping into his voice as he realized that his authority meant nothing here. "I can make you an overseer. I can give you privileges, a better cabin, better food. You don't have to do this. We can work together." "My father made that bargain," Denzel replied, his voice heavy with the weight of inherited pain. "He became your tool to save his own life, and it destroyed him. He died knowing that he had been forced to murder his own people, that he had become complicit in his own oppression. I won't make the same choice. I won't let you turn me into what you made him." The storm outside reached its peak as the reckoning inside the shed came to its conclusion. Thunder crashed overhead like the voice of divine judgment, and lightning illuminated the scene through the small windows, casting everything in stark black and white. The rain hammered against the roof with increasing intensity, as if the very heavens were weeping for the years of suffering that were finally being answered. When it was over, Denzel stood alone among the fallen, the chains still wrapped around his arms, like the armor of a warrior who had finally won his war. The shed that had been a place of torture and death had become a place of justice. The instruments of oppression had been turned against the oppressors, and the cycle of violence had been broken, if only for this moment. But Denzel knew that his fight was far from over. Outside, the plantation still held hundreds of enslaved people who deserved their freedom. The system that had created this horror was still in place, and it would take more than one night of justice to bring it down. There would be consequences for his actions. Other masters, other overseers, other enforcers of the system would come seeking revenge. As he prepared to leave the shed, Denzel looked one last time at his father's chains. They had served their purpose, but their work was not yet done. There were other plantations, other masters, other systems of oppression that needed to be confronted. The chains had been transformed from symbols of bondage into instruments of liberation, and that transformation was irreversible. Denzel wrapped the chains around his waist like a belt, a symbol of his transformation from victim to liberator. The hangman's son had become something his father never could have imagined, a force for justice in a world that had forgotten what justice meant. The storm was beginning to pass, but Denzel's revolution was just beginning. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows of the punishment shed, painting the wooden walls in shades of gold and crimson, Denzel stood among the consequences of his actions like a general surveying a battlefield. The 6 masters who had terrorized the plantation for decades lay still, their reign of cruelty finally ended, their faces frozen in expressions of shock and disbelief. But Denzel felt no triumph, only a profound sense of completion, as if a debt that had been accumulating for generations had finally been paid in full. He stepped outside into the cool morning air, the chains still wrapped around his waist like a badge of honor earned through blood and suffering. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and somehow different, as if the very air had been purified by the night's events. The red clay soil was dark with moisture, and the cotton fields stretched out before him like a white sea under the pale morning sky. In the distance, he could see the slave quarters beginning to stir as people prepared for another day of forced labor, unaware that their world had changed forever during the night. But today would be different. Today would be the first day of a new world. Denzel walked purposefully toward the quarters, his footsteps echoing in the morning silence, each step carrying him further from his past as a victim and closer to his future as a liberator. As he approached the familiar rows of wooden cabins, doors began to open and faces appeared. Faces marked by years of suffering, but also by an unmistakable spark of hope that had somehow survived despite everything they had endured. Sarah, the kitchen worker who had been marked for punishment and family separation, was the first to speak. She emerged from her cabin with her son Marcus close behind, both of them moving with the cautious uncertainty of people who had learned that hope could be dangerous. "Denzel, what happened? We heard shouting from the shed last night, and then everything went quiet." Denzel looked into her eyes, seeing not just Sarah, but all the people who had suffered under the master's cruelty, all the families that had been torn apart, all the dreams that had been deferred but not destroyed. "It's over," he said simply, his voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed to transform the very air around them. "They can't hurt us anymore. They can't hurt anyone anymore." And word spread quickly through the quarters like wildfire, carried from cabin to cabin by whispered conversations and urgent gestures. People emerged from their homes, gathering around Denzel with a mixture of fear and hope, disbelief and desperate longing. They had lived with oppression for so long that freedom seemed impossible. Even when it stood before them in the form of a man they had known all their lives, but who now seemed transformed into something larger than himself. "What do we do now?" asked Marcus, Sarah's teenage son, who had been destined for sale to the sugar plantations of Louisiana. His young face was a mixture of excitement and terror, the expression of someone who had been given an unexpected gift, but wasn't sure if it was real or if it would be taken away. "Where do we go? How do we live?" Denzel had been thinking about this question all night, even as he carried out his grim work in the punishment shed. Freedom was more than just the absence of chains. It was the presence of choice, the ability to determine one's own destiny, the right to live with dignity and purpose. "We have choices now," he said, his voice growing stronger as more people gathered around him. "Real choices. Some of you might want to head north, try to reach the free states where slavery has been abolished. Others might want to stay and work this land as free people, to build something new from the ashes of the old. But whatever we choose it together." Old Thomas, who had worked the fields for 60 years and whose back was permanently bent from decades of labor, shook his head in disbelief. His weathered hands trembled as he reached out to touch Denzel's arm, as if to confirm that this moment was real and not just another dream of freedom that would fade with the morning light. Free? After all this time? How do we know it's real? How do we know they won't come back? Denzel unwrapped the chains from his waist and held them up for all to see, the metal gleaming in the morning sunlight like a symbol of transformation. "These chains bound my father to their will," he said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "They were meant to bind me too, to make me complicit in my own oppression and the oppression of others. But last night they became something else. They became justice." He walked to the center of the gathering and placed the chains on the ground with ceremonial gravity. "We're going to bury these," he announced, his words carrying the weight of ritual and rebirth. "We're going to bury them deep, along with everything they represent, and then we're going to build something new, something that honors the memory of those who died and the dreams of those who survived." The burial of the chains became a ceremony of liberation that would be remembered for generations. Every person on the plantation participated, from the oldest field hand to the youngest child, each one adding their own handful of earth to cover the symbols of their former bondage. They dug a deep hole near the old oak tree that had witnessed so much suffering over the decades, its gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like arms raised in supplication or celebration. As they covered the chains with soil, people began to speak, their voices joining together in a chorus of memory and hope. They spoke of family members who had been sold away, of friends who had died under the lash, of dreams that had been crushed but not destroyed. They spoke of their fears about the future and their hopes for their children, of the uncertainty that lay ahead and the determination to face it together. Denzel listened to each voice, understanding that his role had changed fundamentally. He was no longer just the hangman's son, carrying the burden of his father's forced complicity in the system of oppression. He was a leader, a symbol of resistance, and a guardian of their newfound freedom. The weight of that responsibility was enormous, but it was a weight he was prepared to bear. In the days that followed, news of the plantation's liberation spread throughout the region like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Some enslaved people from neighboring plantations began to arrive, seeking the freedom they had heard was possible. carrying with them stories of their own suffering and their own dreams of liberation. Denzel and the others welcomed them, sharing their resources and their knowledge, building a community that grew stronger with each new arrival. They organized themselves into a community of free people, making decisions collectively and ensuring that everyone had a voice in determining their shared future. The plantation's resources, the land, the tools, the buildings that had once been instruments of oppression, were shared among all who chose to stay. They established committees to handle different aspects of their new society: food distribution, security, education, and planning for the future. Denzel established a school in the old punishment shed, transforming the place of torture into a place of learning and growth. The symbolism was intentional and powerful. Where once there had been screams of pain, now there were voices raised in learning and discovery. Sarah became the teacher, using her knowledge to help others learn to read and write, skills that had been forbidden to them under the old system, but were now seen as essential tools of freedom. The shed that had once echoed with the sounds of suffering now rang with the voices of children learning their letters, adults discovering the power of literacy, and elders sharing the oral traditions that had sustained them through the darkest times. Books were precious and few, but they made do with whatever materials they could find or create, writing lessons on pieces of bark and practicing letters in the dirt. But Denzel knew that their freedom was fragile, built on a foundation that could be shaken by forces beyond their control. The authorities would come eventually, seeking to restore the old order and punish those who had dared to challenge it. Other plantation owners would see their liberation as a threat to their own power, and would work to crush this example of successful resistance before it could inspire others. The community prepared for these challenges with the same determination they had shown in building their new society. They organized patrols to watch for approaching threats, established hiding places for the most vulnerable members of their community, and created plans for evacuation if necessary. But they also prepared to fight for what they had built, understanding that freedom was not something that could be given. It had to be taken and defended. When the federal marshals finally arrived 3 weeks later, riding up the plantation road with the authority of the United States government behind them, they found something they hadn't expected. Instead of a plantation in chaos, they discovered a thriving community of free people who had organized themselves into a functioning society that was more peaceful and productive than many of the surrounding white communities. Denzel met them at the plantation's entrance, no longer the submissive slave they might have expected, but a confident leader who spoke with authority and dignity. He had prepared for this moment, knowing that how he handled this confrontation would determine the fate of everyone who had chosen to follow him into freedom. "We know why you're here," Denzel said calmly, his voice carrying the quiet strength that had become his trademark. "But you should know that we're not going back to the old ways. We're free people now, and we intend to remain free. We've harmed no innocent person, destroyed no property that wasn't used to oppress us, and we've built something good from the ashes of something evil." The lead marshal, a man named Captain Williams, who had seen many plantations in his career, studied Denzel with curiosity rather than hostility. There was something about this man that commanded respect, something that spoke of natural leadership and moral authority. "You're the one they call the Hangman's son?" "I was," Denzel replied, without shame or apology. "Now I'm just a free man protecting his community and working to build a better future for all of us." Captain Williams had seen many plantations in his career, but he had never seen anything like this. The people were organized, productive, and clearly committed to their freedom. More importantly, they had the law on their side. The masters who might have claimed ownership were dead, and there were no legal heirs to challenge the community's right to the land. The federal government was already moving toward emancipation, and this community represented a successful model of what freed slaves could accomplish when given the opportunity. "The government is changing," Captain Williams said finally, his voice thoughtful. "There's talk of emancipation, of a war that might end slavery forever. What you've done here, it might be a preview of what's coming to the entire nation." Denzel nodded, understanding the larger implications of their small revolution. "Then we'll be ready," he said with quiet confidence. "We've learned that freedom isn't something that's given. It's something that's taken and defended. We've learned that people who have been told they're less than human can govern themselves, educate their children, and build prosperous lives when given the opportunity." As the years passed, Denzel's community became a beacon of hope for enslaved people throughout the South. Proof that the impossible was possible, that the system of oppression could be challenged and overcome. They proved that former slaves could govern themselves, educate their children, and build prosperous lives when given the opportunity. Their success inspired other acts of resistance and became a model for Reconstruction efforts after the Civil War. Denzel never forgot the weight of his father's chains, or the night when he chose justice over submission. He kept a single link from those chains as a reminder, not of bondage, but of the moment when he decided to break free from the cycle of oppression that had defined his family's existence. The hangman's son had become something greater than his father ever imagined, a liberator, a leader, and a symbol of the truth that no chain is strong enough to bind the human spirit forever. When Denzel was an old man, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had never known slavery, he would tell them the story of that stormy night in 1859. He would remind them that freedom is precious because it is hard-won, that justice sometimes requires ordinary people to do extraordinary things, and that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance against those who would take it away. The chains were buried, but the memory of their breaking lived on, a testament to the power of courage, the necessity of justice, and the unbreakable strength of the human desire for freedom. Denzel lived to see the end of the Civil War and the official abolition of slavery throughout the United States. His community became one of the first successful examples of Reconstruction, proving that former slaves could thrive when given the opportunity and resources to build their own lives. The school he established in the old punishment shed educated hundreds of children over the decades, many of whom went on to become teachers, doctors, lawyers, and leaders in their own right, carrying forward the legacy of education and self-determination that Denzel had begun. The story of the hangman's son spread far beyond Georgia, becoming a legend whispered in slave quarters and later celebrated in freedom songs that echoed across the South. It reminded people that even in the darkest times, even when the system seems unbreakable and oppression appears eternal, individuals have the power to choose justice over submission, courage over fear, and hope over despair. Denzel's chains remained buried beneath the old oak tree, but their breaking echoed through history, a reminder that no oppression lasts forever, that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice, and that sometimes the instruments of bondage can become the tools of liberation when wielded by those who refuse to accept their assigned place in an unjust world. The hangman's son had found his true inheritance, not the chains of his father's shame and forced complicity, but the unbreakable bonds of justice, community, and freedom that connected him to all those who had suffered and all those who would benefit from his courage. His legacy lived on in every person who chose to stand up against injustice, in every community that came together to protect the vulnerable, and in every generation that refused to accept that things had to remain as they had always been. The chains were broken, the cycle was ended, and the future was free, If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Share this powerful tale of courage and justice with others who need to hear it. History's greatest lessons come from ordinary people who chose to do extraordinary things. What other untold stories of courage would you like us to explore? Let us know in the comments below. Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction. While it draws inspiration from the historical realities of slavery in the American South, the characters, events, and specific details are products of imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. This narrative is intended to honor the memory of those who suffered under slavery and to explore themes of justice, resistance, and human dignity within a historical context.